"Which are your windows?" asked he of the Count, with as much indifference as he could assume. "The last three," returned he, with a negligence evidently unaffected, for he could not imagine with what intention the question was put. Franz glanced rapidly towards the three windows. The side windows were hung with yellow damask, and the center one with white damask and a red cross. The man in the mantle had kept his promise to the Transteverin, and there could now be no doubt that he was the Count. The three windows were still untenanted. Preparations were making on every side. Chairs were placed, scaffolds were raised, and windows were hung with flags. The masks could not appear. The carriages could not move about. But the masks were visible behind the windows, the carriages, and the doors. Franz, Albert, and the Count continued to descend the Corso. As they approached the Piazza del Popolo, the crowd became more dense, and above the heads of the multitude, two objects were visible. The obelisk, surmounted by a cross, which marks the center of the square, and in front of the obelisk, at the point where the three streets, del Balbuino, del Corso, and di Ripetta, meet, the two uprights of the scaffold, between which glittered the curved knife of the mandaia. At the corner of the street they met the Count's steward, who was awaiting his master. The window, let at an exorbitant price, which the Count had doubtless wished to conceal from his guests, was on the second floor of the great palace, situated between the Via del Balbuino and the Monte Pincio. It consisted, as we have said, of a small dressing room, open into a bedroom, and, when the door of the communication was shut, the inmates were quite alone. On chairs were laid elegant masquerade costumes of blue and white satin. Okay, kind of a transitionary episode today. One of the main things that we get out of this is this line. There could now be no doubt that he was the Count, meaning that in Franz's mind, the man who was in the Colosseum that night was the same man who they are now with, and connecting everything together, because he can see that the man that they are now with is the man that was Sinbad the Sailor from the cave on the island of Monte Cristo. And that they are both doing a sort of performance here. When Franz says, "Which are your windows?" It says that he said that with as much indifference as he could assume. And then Dante returns with the three last, quote, "with a negligence evidently unaffected, for he could not imagine with what intention the question was put." Now, what are we to take of that line, though? Does that mean that Dante doesn't know that Franz was in the Colosseum that night? If he could not imagine the intention behind the question, and Franz's question is related to looking for the signal of the man who said something in the Colosseum, that would lead me to believe that Dante doesn't know that Franz was in the Colosseum and overheard him. There's also this line that made me a little nervous when they all arrive at the intersection of these three main streets. It talks about the two objects that were visible, the obelisk, and then in front of the obelisk, the two uprights of the scaffold, between which glittered the curved knife of the mandaia. The mandaia being the guillotine-like device that Rome used for its executions. It is different and distinct from the French guillotine, but basically serves the same purpose. That's all I really have to say about today's passage, as we're kind of going between two places here. So I'll take this opportunity to mention, and I don't think in the time I've been doing the show I've really talked much about it, but Alexandre Dumas had a son named Alexandre Dumas, and it was a whole thing. And maybe I'll go more into this because there's a lot of information in the biography that I'm just finishing up, the first of three, where Alexandre Dumas, the one that wrote the book we're reading, was kind of upset with his son when he decided to become an author and playwright of his own, because it forced Dumas to have to assume the epithet of père, separating him from his son, which is Alexander Dumas fils. These are essentially like saying senior or junior or the third, but in French. So Dumas, the author of this book, was a little upset because he didn't want to have to assume the senior or invite any confusion into which Dumas was doing what. He didn't want his son, I think, to hone in on his reputation. But I can go into this a little bit later. My point being that I haven't talked a lot about his son at all on this show. I've not read his books, and I'm wondering if it would give us any sort of rich context or interesting context to read at least his most popular, which is called Camille, or Lady of the Camellias, which was successful in its own right and led to its own opera, because he was also writing at the same time as his father, and they had a really interesting relationship. So maybe we go into that at some point. Maybe I'll add Camille to my to-read list the way I did with Three Musketeers, and we can kind of build out what does this Dumas dynasty look like? What sort of... I'm wondering if, like, reading what his son wrote about and how he wrote will give us any insight into what Dumas is doing. How are they different from each other? What similarities do they have? It might just like highlight some of those things. I'm trying to decide which of the two biographies to go into next. I have one that's just kind of a even more basic sketch of Dumas' life, much shorter than the one I just read. But I have another one called The Three Titans, or maybe it's just called The Titans. But it's a generational biography from General Dumas, or Thomas Alexander Dumas d'Avis de Pageantry. I don't know if I'm saying that right at all. Very long name, but essentially his father, who was a general in Napoleon's army and had his own crazy life, and then Dumas himself, and then Dumas' son, Dumas. So the three Alexandre Dumas. That one sounds kind of interesting. It's a bit older, so I don't know if the information is still correct or to modern understanding, but we got some reading to do, and I got some reporting to do. I haven't even begun to really dive into all the bookmarks I have in my current biography, so I should start weaving those in soon. That's all I got for today. Join me here tomorrow. Until then, okay, goodbye. The Countdown of Monte Cristo is part of the Gruntwork Podcast Network. This show is produced, edited, and hosted by Landon Solano. The original text of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Theme song by Magic Solo. If you want to support the show and others like it, visit patreon.com/gruntworkpod. Thank you for listening. See you tomorrow.